Lesson number 8 on page 113 deals with why did the Jews reject Jesus? And this is kind of going back to an earlier theme from the very outset, but he's going to develop this theme to a greater degree, dealing with it on a more personal level, individual level, in this particular lecture or lesson. And I love the opening line. I think it serves us well to be reminded of these things. The causes of failure to understand or agree with the New Testament teaching today are the same as those of the days of Jesus and the apostles. In other words, every reason that one might determine why one would reject the teaching of the New Testament, the teaching of Jesus, the teaching of His inspired apostles, are the exact same things today as they were 2,000 years ago. Because man is essentially unchanged even since the beginning of time. And so if we can look into the Scriptures, and we can, and the Scriptures give us a particular and remarkable insight into the character of man, the nature of man, the propensities of man, and so with these things in mind, I want us to look at some of the things on page 113. Close this door, probably blowing right out in there. See there, still in that first paragraph, the basic cause for the rejection of Jesus' teaching among both Jews and Gentiles during the time of Jesus' ministry and that of the apostles was ignorance. And we find that phrase over and over again, being ignorant, not knowing. Had they known, for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, if they had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So the phrase, if they had known, indicates that they were ignorant. There were some things they didn't know, they should have known. And thus they pursued a course of action that was contrary to their spiritual well-being because of ignorance. Now moving on down just a little bit in this same paragraph, about 2/3 of the way down, the sentence begins, this plan of study has been followed with the hope that we might better understand why the people of the New Testament times, many of whom witnessed the miracles of Jesus and the apostles, remained in ignorance, refusing to accept Jesus' teaching as the truth. And so it's just sometimes we are amazed at how people rejected the teaching of Jesus. For example, in John chapter 11, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, and everybody there knew he was dead. They all knew he'd been dead for 4 days, and without any question or any doubt, Jesus raised that man from the dead. And yet, the people who witnessed it, or say many of the people who witnessed it, didn't believe it, or didn't believe in Jesus, didn't accept his teaching, turned around and went back to the Jewish authorities who were informed that Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. And rather than accepting the person and the teaching of Jesus, they thought that, well, we'll just kill Lazarus, we'll just get rid of this problem, and we'll kill Jesus too. Just an amazing mindset that permits people to reject the person and the teaching of Christ. And yet, these accounts are left for us in the pages of the Bible, and we find that men still reject those accounts today for much of the same reason. All right, now on page 114. Dealing with, and this is the way the book has always followed, it says it's going to begin with the Jews and move to the Gentiles. So, why did the Jews reject Jesus? Then we'll move to why did the Gentiles reject Jesus? But beginning with the Jews in Matthew 11, and in verses 1 through 19. 1 through 19. Jesus deals with two different situations. First, he deals with those who had been sent to him by John the Baptizer. Then, after addressing those individuals, Jesus turns his attention to the audience at hand. So let's look at this text together very quickly. It says, beginning in verse 1, "And it came to pass when Jesus finished commanding his 12 disciples that he departed from there to teach and preach in their cities. And when John had heard in prison about the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to him, 'Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?' Jesus answered and said to them, 'Go and tell John again the things which you hear and see. The blind see, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who is not offended because of me.' And as they departed," Jesus said, there's the dealing with the first situation. Now he says, "And as they were departing, or had departed, Jesus began to say to the multitudes concerning John." Now John, had sent these disciples to ensure or to be reassured that Jesus was indeed the coming one. Which seems interesting because John pointed to him from the very beginning, right? In John chapter 1, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. This is he of whom I've been telling you." But then John ends up in prison, and then his faith begins to waver. And so Jesus reassures him, I'm the one. And so then Jesus turns his attention to the multitudes and begins to teach them and talk to them about John. And here's what he says. "What did you go out in the wilderness to see?" Because John the Baptist was an outdoorsman. That's a kind way of putting it. He lived in the wilderness, wore a camel hair coat, ate locusts and wild honey. "What did you go out to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? Those who wear soft clothing live in kings' houses. What did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, and more than a prophet." Here it is, verse 10. "For this is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. And assuredly I say to you, among those born of women, there is not risen one greater than John the Baptist, but he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." Now verse 13. "For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to receive it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And so Jesus begins this instruction about John the Baptist. But ultimately, think about this. Ultimately, in talking to them about John the Baptist, who is he really talking about? Who is he really talking about?
He's talking about Christ.
That's right. He's talking about himself.
Yep.
When Jesus is instructing these people in the matters pertaining to John the Baptizer, he's really not teaching them so much about John the Baptizer as he is talking to them about himself. What was the question that John's disciples asked of Jesus? What was the question? I just read it to you. What is it?
Well, they wanted to know if he was the one that was to come.
Are you the coming one? And Jesus answers that question how? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Well, he told them that they saw what was there, and they ought to know. Really.
That's right.
That's what he said.
So, but in essence, he says, yes, I'm the coming one. Now, the Old Testament, in the book of Isaiah, and the book of Malachi in particular, spoke of one who was going to come ahead of the coming one. And Jesus said, John the Baptizer is the one that Malachi was talking about. John the Baptizer is the one whom Isaiah the prophet was talking about. Therefore, if John the Baptist is the forerunner, then of necessity, who does that make me? The coming one. So if you'll recognize that John the Baptist is the forerunner, then by extension you'll recognize that I'm the one that he was the forerunner for. And so by teaching them about John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, he's actually pointing the audience to himself and to who he really was. Now, in those days, there are a number of reasons why some, by the way, there were a lot of misunderstandings about John the Baptist. If you read John chapter 1, they said, "Are you the Christ?" He said, "I am not." "Are you Elijah?" "Nope." But Jesus turns around and says, he is Elijah. But he's not literally Elijah. Now, here's some of the misunderstandings that many of the Jews had about John the Baptizer, thus leading to confusion and ignorance about Jesus. What did Herod say when he heard about the miracles of Jesus? What did Herod say when he heard about the miracles of Jesus? That's right. This is John whom I have beheaded, and he's come back. So he really believed that John the Baptizer, or that Jesus was John the Baptizer, resurrected from the dead. So there was, in other words, there was a clear indication that people believed that folks could come back from the dead in those days, right? And so it may be the case that the Jews, and it's speculated in the book and in some of the other commentaries, that the Jews were expecting the literal Elijah to come back. Although he wouldn't have been coming back from the dead because he didn't die. But that God would literally send back Elijah. "Behold, I send you Elijah the prophet before the great and dreadful day of the Lord." It may have been that they were looking for the literal Elijah. And yet John said he wasn't the literal Elijah. All right, so there's a lot of misunderstanding about who this forerunner is, who this one who's going to come before the Messiah is. And so Jesus clarifies that John the Baptist is Elijah, but he's not literally Elijah. He is a figure of Elijah. Now, let me ask you this. What were some of the ways that John the Baptist and Elijah were alike? All right.
There's going to be a heaven somewhere.
All right.
It's all going to go there.
All right. They're both interested. They're both of them interested in the Messiah. What about any physical or societal characteristics? Where'd John live? Where'd John live? Wilderness. Where'd Elijah live? Wilderness. What John wear? Camel hair coat. What kind of clothing did Elijah wear? What did John eat? Locusts and wild honey. What did Elijah eat? Basically whatever he could find or what the birds brought him, right? And so these two men were very similar in their physical characteristics. Let me ask you this. Was there any similarity in their preaching? Was there any similarity in the preaching of Elijah and John the Baptizer? I'll ask you a question. Those of you that would know, is there any let me ask you, does Bill Burke preach exactly like I do?
Well, he probably teaches the same thing, but as far as being exact, no.
No.
He's not.
All right. Does Roger Johnson preach like I preach?
No.
Oh. Do we preach the same message?
Yes.
But our preaching styles are really different, right? All right. So, but there might be somebody that preaches like me. Daryl might preach like me, or I might preach like Daryl. I don't know. Or Frank Chesser. I'd never compare myself to Frank Chesser, but only in the sense that Frank and I, when we get in the pulpit, can be really intense. Now, Frank never cracks a joke or a smile or anything. That'd be far different than me. I'm not always just machine gunning. Like Frank does. But in other words, we know that preachers can share certain styles, right? And their attitudes can be very similar. And the preaching of John the Baptist would have certainly would have certainly mimicked the preaching of Elijah, right? I mean, did John the Baptist, well, let me ask you this, was John the Baptist to tell it like it is preaching? Was he a fearless preacher?
Well, I believe he was fearless.
He was fearless. What did he tell Herod? It is not lawful for you to have your brother Philip's wife. Now, what did that end up getting him? Beheaded. Jailed and beheaded. But what did Elijah tell Ahab? What did Elijah say about Jezebel? In other words, these guys were up front, in your face proclaimers of the Word of God. And so these people should have seen in John the Baptist the characteristics that they knew about Elijah the prophet. And so that's why Jesus was able to say, this is Elijah who was for to come. Now, the second thing is, now he's going to shift gears. He's going to point to himself. Now, he's already pointing to himself, but he's going to be more explicit. Verse 16, Matthew 11. But what shall I liken this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to their companions and saying, we played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We mourned to you, and you did not lament. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they said he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a wine-bibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children. Wisdom is justified by her children. Now, I think probably, now let me just make mention here. I think that Brother Stroop probably misses a little bit of the context here on page 115 when he's talking about children in the marketplace. And the only reason I say that is because all the commentaries that I read, because he says that a child in the marketplace is an abnormal situation. Whereas almost all the commentators say children in the marketplace is not an abnormal situation. It's just that it was a common area where business was transacted, and it wouldn't have been unusual at all for people to have their children there. All right? So I think you may have missed it there. All right? But that's not really overly relevant to the overall scheme of what Stroop is about to say, because what I read from I believe it was H. Leo Bowles wrote the Gospel Advocate commentary on Matthew, and I got a really good commentary by Ken Chumley. And so all three of these guys end up in the same place in regard to this series of statements. All right. So, but I want you to think about on page 115, Jesus compares the generation to children. Now let me ask you this. Is being child with regard to the kingdom of God, is being childlike a good thing or a bad thing?
Good. Except you come as little children.
Walter mentions Matthew 18:3. It's a good thing. But let me ask you this. Did Jesus compare his audience to children? In this case? Did he? Was it a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I don't think it's too good.
That's right, it's bad. So that's a trick question. Being a child in matters of spiritual nature with regard to the kingdom of God is good or bad depending on the context of what you mean by being a child. As Walter just ended, let's go ahead, Sean. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say one was it's like a meekness, and the other is like ignorance.
Yeah.
Because a child is ignorant of things, and he's been speaking of this. What book speaks about the ignorance of men. I mean, is that kind of word you was saying?
Yeah. It's good or bad depending on what characteristics you're talking about, right? If you're talking about being led, being submissive, being willing to be taught, because children naturally want to learn, right? That's why when they're little, they ask you about 6,000 questions a day. And when they're little, it's just question after question after question after question. And everybody that's raised kids, Kyle, your day's coming. I know you're ready for Ellis to really start talking, but there's going to be a time, not in the very distant future, you're going to wish he'd be quiet. All right? Hey, if you don't believe me, ask that girl sitting back there in the corner. Because she's got one that talks. Does he ask you a lot of questions, Fallon? Lots of questions. So if you're eager to learn, that's a good thing. Right? But there are other aspects of being a child that aren't good. What did Paul say? When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. And so, being childlike can be good or bad depending on the context in which it is used. And in this particular context, it is not good. And it is a reference to selfishness. It is a reference to selfishness. Now look, children, and by the way, and this is human nature, we are naturally selfish people, right? We are naturally selfish. Children have to be taught to share, right? Sometimes they have to be forced to share so that they can be taught to share. And that's not a good characteristic of children, and that's how Jesus is referring to the generation in which he was preaching. He said, you're like kids in the marketplace. He said, we've piped to you, and you've not danced. In other words, we've invited you to play, and you don't want to play. So then we invited you to mourn, and you didn't want to mourn either. In other words, you wanted to do things your way. By the way, have you ever had to instruct a child or keep a child from doing things their own way? Because you know that their way is not the right way? And sometimes even if you can or if you can't, sometimes you can't explain why things ought not be the way they are. Sometimes you can't explain, why things can't be the way that the child wants it. Does the child just always readily accept it? Or sometimes they swell up and cry. And they will pitch a fit because they want to have things their way. And it doesn't matter how much you explain it, they're going to have things, they're going to have things their way. And that's what Jesus is saying about the generation of Jews in that day. We tried to get you to be happy. You didn't want to be happy. We tried to get you to lament. You didn't want to lament. You just wanted things your way. In other words, as long as the idea is your idea, you're all about it. But if it's not about your idea, you're not as willing to accept it. Now, the funny thing about that is, I was talking with a good friend of mine, Keith Kasarjan. Keith works for Bear Valley, and he goes to Africa a lot to go to our various schools of preaching over there. And, of course, the school that we support in Takoradi is now associated with Bear Valley. It's a Bear Valley Extension School. And I said, we were running, Keith's a runner. He's a really good runner. And we were running one morning at PTP. And I said, when's the last time? I said, you been to Takoradi lately? He said, November. I said, I was there last November. I said, how did you find the school? He said, the school is fine. I said, well, how did you find the things that we did back in 2015, that, the raised bed gardens and the chickens and all that? And he said, they didn't do anything with the chicken tractors after y'all left. So they didn't do anything with them. He said, and they're not growing any food in the raised bed gardens. I mean, that's why Andy and I went in 2015, was to show them how to use those things to help them, grow their own food and learn how to grow their own food. And so when they left the school of preaching, and here's what Keith said. He says, you know how Ghanaians are. And it's not just about Ghanaians, but a lot of times they're prone to this. if it's not their idea, they're not very ready to embrace it. If it's not their idea. And so, Andy and I went over there and we spent, I mean the church in America spent thousands of dollars to send me and Andy to Africa. And we spent, quite a bit of money in building those facilities at the site of the school. And now Keith says they're not using them because it's not their idea. It's not their idea. Now, if that aggravates you half as much as it aggravates me, you're aggravated. And yet we can still fall trap to this. We can all fall trap to the same mentality. That if it's not our idea, we're not as ready to embrace it as if it was ours. And when we're dealing with matters of a spiritual nature, none of the ideas are our ideas. Right? Now, how does this translate over into why do people not see the Bible alike? Well, people get certain ideas about the Bible, right? Whether or not they accord with what the Bible teaches, right? And so they've determined what they believe is truth and have determined as to be truth. And as we said a couple of weeks ago, their faith is in their own faith about their beliefs. In other words, I believe what I believe, and I believe that I'm right, regardless of what the Bible may say.
Well, I'll tell you one thing I thought of was when God set up a way for the children of Israel to live and how to govern themselves, but they wanted a king.
That's exactly right, Walter.
When you read this, they wanted a king, all right? That's what you got to now. That's how the people here now think. That's, out in these congregations as such, teach various things, but it's usually their idea.
That's exactly
Here
right.
it comes.
Now, let me go exactly what Walter said. The children of Israel had God's plan, right? Because we talked about this in this book. The children of Israel had God's plan on how they were to be governed and how they would live their daily lives. They said, we want a king to go out and fight our battles for us and go out before us, etc. Samuel went and pleaded with them, begged them. This is not God's plan. That's first and foremost the reason not to do it. But then Samuel went into very vivid detail as to all the negative aspects of having a king. You're going to pay more taxes. You're going to lose your property because he's just going to claim it. He's going to take your sons and your... Now, think about this. When he said he's going to take your sons and daughters to serve him, think about that. What kind of society, what type of economy did those people have in those days primarily? What were they? What were they? Farmers. That's right, Jeffrey. They were farmers. Now, let's imagine that I'm a farmer and you're my son, and I'm depending on you to help me farm, right? And then the king decides, well, I need Jeffrey as a song leader, just, or whatever he wants Jeffrey to be. He said, he don't have to ask my permission to take him, does he? So then he takes Jeffrey, and then what's that do to me? I've lost half of my labor force, right? And so when Samuel says he's going to take your sons and daughters, that got personal. About their own business, about their livelihood, about how things got handled, in their day-to-day activities. You take a daughter, what have you taken? You've taken somebody that cooks. You've taken somebody that might gather. You take somebody that might garden. You take somebody that might make your clothes. And you take them out of the equation. And so Samuel pleads with the people, and he gets right down to the nitty-gritty about all the bad things that are going to happen if you go this route. And then what did they say?
They still want a king.
Give us a king anyway.
Like all the other nations.
Yeah. But just like a bunch of little kids. Right? I want to eat cupcakes and candy for breakfast and lunch and supper. And then you try to explain to them why that's not good. You know what? I want candy and cupcakes anyway. That's exactly what the children of Israel did. Yeah, we hear you, but we don't care. We want what we want. And Jesus was saying of the Jews, they want what they want. No matter how bad it's going to be for them personally. To what shall I liken this generation? Now, let me add this before we get to our next bell. Final bell. What's the first word in verse 18? What's the first word in verse 18? For. So what's that mean?
Because of what has been said before. All
right. In other words, Jesus is fixing to explain, beginning in verse 18, what has just been said in verses 16 and 17. So verses 18 and following are an explanation of what he meant by children in the marketplace who would not laugh, nor would they lament. For John came neither eating nor drinking. So who is he? Is he the piper or the lamenter? He's the lamenter. John came neither eating nor drinking. He led a very austere life. Not flashy, not concerned in any way with this world's goods or the acceptance or the conversation, association with men. John didn't just go and hang out with people. That just wasn't him. Now John came neither eating nor drinking. He's the lamenter. And what did you say about him? He has a devil or a demon. But I came, what? Eating and drinking. So notice, so Jesus is the who? Is he the piper or the lamenter? He's the piper, right? Notice, John didn't do anything that y'all do. You said he had a devil. I came and I lived right amongst you. I ate the food you ate. I wore the clothes you wear. I basically lived the kind of life that y'all live. You reject John on the basis that he doesn't live like you. Here I come. I do live like you. And you say I'm a glutton and a wine bibber, a friend of publicans and sinners. In other words, they couldn't be satisfied as long as it didn't accord with their ideas. And so we have to be on guard against that. So when Jesus talks about John the Baptizer in verse 18, John the Baptizer is the lamenter, and Jesus is the piper, and they're not satisfied either. They're not satisfied either way. Now, last line of verse 19.
Well, throw in one thing. They didn't understand that he came to seek and save the lost.
Well, that's true.
They did not understand.
And there's a lot of things they didn't understand.
Yeah, but that's just one of them. Just showing up right there.
And it says, but wisdom is justified of their children. I want to think about that line right there. There's a couple of different ways to look at this phrase. And I think both of them are valid. I think one probably stronger than the other. Ultimately, I think what Jesus is saying is that whatever you want to believe, you can justify in your own mind. No matter how inconsistent it might be. In other words, you don't even realize how foolish you are. That you reject John on the basis that he doesn't live like you, and you reject me on the basis that I do live like you. In other words, that is just plain foolish. Wisdom is justified by her children. Now here's the secondary idea, and I think very closely akin. The wisdom of an action can be seen in the result of the action itself. In other words, when an action is taken, it may not be known whether that action is wise or foolish. But when the result of the action is seen, then we know whether or not an action was wise or foolish. You know, somebody might think they like hot food and they eat one of them ghost peppers. Whether or not the wisdom of that action is wise or foolish will be seen about 10 seconds after they eat that ghost pepper. Usually it's going to be foolish. Unless you're trying to make a real funny Facebook video, you know, of you crying and sweating and everything else. And so Jesus is saying, those of you that reject John and then turn around and reject me, the end result of this is it's going to show you how unwise you really are. Wisdom is justified by her results, not by how people justify the way they believe what they do. I'll give you one text before we quit. Look in Luke 7, 29 and 30, and we'll pick up in this text, in this lesson, Lord willing, next week. Luke 7, 29 and 30. When all the people heard him speak about Jesus, and this is in this same context, by the way. This is the same context. This is a parallel account. When all the people heard him, even the tax collectors justified God being baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and lawyers rejected the will of God for themselves, not having been justified by him. In other words, the people that they condemned in their own lives accepted the teaching of Jesus and of John, and believed the teaching of John and acted accordingly. But the Pharisees and the others, they rejected the teaching of John, and the end result of that is we'll see the wisdom, obviously, or lack thereof, of the course of action that they have taken. And that's where Brother Stroop picks up, and that's where we'll pick up, Lord willing, next week.